Good afternoon. If commissioners can please take their seats. We will call the Atlantic Menhaden Management Board meeting to order. My name is Nicola Meserve from the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, serving as your chair today. You have an agenda before you. Would anyone like to make any additions to the agenda today? Seeing none, we'll consider that approved. We have the proceedings from February of 2019 to approve as well. Are there any modifications to those proceedings? Seeing none, we'll also consider those approved and move on to public comment. This is a time for members of the public to comment on items that are not on the agenda. If there is anyone that would like to comment, they can come forward to the public microphone. Seeing none, we will move on to a progress update on the 2019 Menhaden Single Species and Ecological Reference Point Benchmark Stock Assessments, and Drs. Anstead and Drew will be providing us with that update.
Thank you. So I will give you an update on the single species assessment. We are coming up to our peer review in October, and I just want to fill you in on some of the changes you might see from the previous stock assessment, CDAR 2015. So it's pretty much a similar stock assessment, so it'll be in the spirit of that last assessment. We have made some updates on some of the inputs. This includes fecundity. We have an updated value on Menhaden fecundity from VIMS, and it has resulted in a slightly higher fecundity than the previous benchmark. We have updated natural mortality, so that has resulted in a higher M at age. We have revised our indices somewhat. So last time we had the Northern Index, the Southern Index for adults, and then a YOY index. This time we also have the YOY Northern and Southern indices for the adults, but we have added a Mid-Atlantic index, and the fishery independent surveys that went into each of those is slightly different from the last benchmark. We also have some expanded uncertainty analysis to address some of the peer review comments from last time, so we have done some additional things. And then finally, we have some other changes, and there's a table in the report that will outline the changes between the two, but I think those are some of the highlights to start thinking about. And then finally, for the reference points, they will be the ones you're used to seeing for single species for Atlantic Menhaden. So the current fishing mortality reference point, we have the median geometric mean F for ages 2 to 4. That's our target, and then the maximum, which is a threshold. And then we have the population fecundity values that are associated with those F target and threshold. So the same thing that you're used to seeing from last time will be there again, but with some changes in some of the inputs, which have resulted in slightly different values throughout the assessment.
Are there any questions about the single species assessment? We can also, okay, we'll go to that. Emerson Hasberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on that review, I didn't quite follow. Did you say that there was higher fecundity, and that led you to a higher M at age? Did I follow that, or no?
We have updated data for both fecundity and natural mortality, and that has resulted in two different things. So our revised fecundity relationship for the assessment has resulted in a higher fecundity value for Menhaden. These were results from a study that VIMS has done to address a research recommendation. Natural mortality is different. There has been an updated tagging study, so it analyzed the old tagging data and just provided some new values. So we're using the same methods to estimate natural mortality, but we're scaling them to that tagging study because we think that's the best available science right now, and so that has resulted in slightly higher natural mortality at age. So they're two separate inputs that have been slightly revised that have resulted in different things.
Any additional questions? If not, we'll move on to Dr. Drew's update.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So for the ERP assessment, we are obviously still on track and going through with the same timeline as the single species assessment. I think, we've laid out for you guys before some of the models that we're considering. We're still going forward with a suite of models that range from very simple with minimal assumptions about ecosystem dynamics to very complex with a lot of data requirements and a lot of assumptions about the ecosystem. And so we feel that it's important to present this story about the range of complexity, the range of information that you need, and the range of information that you can get out of all of these different models to kind of set the stage for an ecosystem management context, since this is not really something that's been done before for management. However, we will be providing a single sort of recommended approach to develop the ecosystem reference points, so that we say, here's the models that we looked at, here's what they say about each other and what they say about ecosystem reference points for this species, here's our recommended management approach to develop quota recommendations that take into account menhaden's role as a forage fish. So I think we'll get, in October, we're planning to come back and have a more detailed update about the models that we're looking at and some of the different options that we'll get out of them. But for now, I just want to kind of explain our approach. The other thing to keep in mind is we're really focused on giving you guys a method to set these ecological reference points, that there is not one single best value for menhaden because it depends on kind of the trade-offs that you want to make in other parts of the ecosystem. So if you want to increase fishing on your predators, that gives you a different reference point for menhaden than if you want to decrease fishing pressure on your predators, and vice versa. So we'll give you guys a method and a framework to make some of these evaluations, and we're also going to put forward some example scenarios. So what do the reference point look like if we fish all of our predators at their target species and at their target F rate and want to keep them at their target biomass values? What does it look like if we fish the predators at their threshold F rates and keep them above their threshold values? So obviously you can envision this as there's a lot of different moving parts, there's a lot of combinations, and a lot of those come down to management questions about what do you value in this ecosystem, not just for menhaden but for the predators. So we'll provide you with some example scenarios. We'll have the review of the method and kind of get that peer review feedback on, is this the right approach for menhaden for ecosystem reference points? And then we'll put this in front of the board, and I think you guys will have to start having the conversations about how do you want to evaluate the trade-offs for different predators, for different prey species, and the current management framework, not just for menhaden, but for all of these other species. So we can give you some starting points, but there'll have to be a lot of conversation, I think, in order to get to a final value that really encompasses what you want for both menhaden and the predators.
Thank you, Dr. Drew. Are there questions? Stu Mickles, please.
Thank you. Hey, Katie, thank you very much. Are there any of the models that you're evaluating that have either risen to the top or just, you know, have you realized that they're just way too complex and you won't be able to do it, or way too simplistic and we won't be able to use them for management, that you can focus your effort a little more?
So yeah, so we've definitely sort of picked out the best, what we think is sort of the best approach, and that's what we'll be presenting to the review panel. I don't want to get too in-depth about that now because I think that could change with the review panel and can change with some of our discussions. But for sure, the focus is on, we think there is a path forward that is sort of the best balance between being able to fully utilize all the data that we have available to us and being able to really capture some of those complex dynamics without getting so complicated that you're having to rely on really weak data sources and a lot of assumptions and things like that, and also without being too simple. So there is definitely kind of a through line of this is the approach that we think is the best in terms of the modeling trade-offs. And I think, but it's great in our perspective the way there actually is really a consistent story out of all of these models. So there are some differences, but really it's a consistent story, and I think the fact that we're getting a consistent story out of a really wide range of modeling approaches strengthens the entire assessment, which is why we want to keep that sort of background or story going forward.
Lynn Fagley?
Thanks. I think that Stu asked my same question, and thank you. I know how much work this is for you guys, so I'm trying to be clear that there are going to be several models. I'm trying to distinguish between model and approach. So there's going to be several models going to the peer review, but from that, there's going to be one recommended approach. And could that approach involve the output from several models, or by approach do you mean there's one recommended model, right? Sorry.
Right, so good question. Right, and I think we're thinking of this now as, I know some people don't like the term preferred model, but we're thinking of this as a preferred model and some supporting models. So these other models support the overall conclusions of our preferred approach. We're calling it a preferred approach because I think what we're looking towards now is really combining the single species model, which we think is the best for, Menhaden specific dynamics, with another more ecosystem oriented model in order to get an approach out rather than saying this is the overall one best model where we are right now. So that's kind of how we are going to see it, but definitely we're aiming for the preferred approach, recommended approach / model, and supporting analyses.
Are there questions at this time on the assessment? Okay, clearly the SAS and ERP are doing a lot of heavy lifting right now, and it'll be incumbent upon the board to get in the game soon. But we'll move on to the review and consideration of the 2019 FMP review and state compliance reports. You may notice this has a little bit more time on the agenda than generally allotted. That's partly because 2018 serves as the first year that the fishery operated under Amendment 3 and the new allocations and associated measures, and it'll also help to lay the ground a little bit for our next discussion about setting the TAC for next year. And we'll begin with a presentation from Max on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A little bit of pressure to fill the time there, I see. Just to restate that the 2019 FMP review covers the 2018 fishing season. This is a lay of the land for my presentation. These are all the different sections of the report, and I'll cover each of them starting with status of the management plan. So stating one more time, 2018 was the first year under the provisions of Amendment 3, and I'm just highlighting some of the big changes that occurred with that amendment. First, that the single species reference points are still what guide management under Amendment 3 until Menhaden-specific ERPs come online. Second, that the allocation of the TAC changed with Amendment 3, so it's a modified fixed minimum where each state gets 0.5% of the TAC, and then the remaining balance is allocated based on the 2009 to 2011 time period. The bycatch provision was sort of rebranded as the Incidental Catch and Small Scale Fisheries provision. The aspects of it remain the same. It also defined applicable gear types for that provision. And lastly, the Chesapeake Bay reduction fishery cap was reduced to 51,000 metric tons, and rollovers are not permitted under Amendment 3. So just highlighting status of the stock with this slide. Again, stock status continues to be based on the 2017 stock assessment update, which indicated the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. The figure 1 is on the top right-hand corner. That's showing fishing mortality through time. You can see in the terminal year the estimate is below both the target and the threshold levels. The bottom figure, figure 2 from the report, showing fecundity in billions of eggs. And again, the terminal year is below the target but above the threshold. As we've already said, the benchmark assessments are on schedule for peer review in November of this year. So this is a summary of landings in 2018 compared to the previous year. All these estimates are in millions of pounds. The TAC for 2018 was set at 216,000 metric tons, which is about 476.2 million pounds. Directed landings in 2018, which includes our episodic events set-aside landings, were estimated at 418.3 million pounds, which is a 11% increase relative to 2017. It also represents a 12% underage of the coastwide TAC. Incidental landings, which don't count towards the TAC, were estimated at 3.2 million pounds, 18% increase relative to 2017, for a total of 421.5 million pounds landed in 2018. Zooming in on the different sectors, so the bait harvest in 2018 was around 110 million pounds. This again is an increase relative to 2017, also above the previous 5-year average. New Jersey, Virginia, Maine, and Massachusetts landed the largest shares for the bait harvest. Moving to the reduction harvest, around 311.6 million pounds, also an increase relative to 2017, a slight increase relative to the previous 5-year average. In the Chesapeake Bay, reduction harvest cap was set at 51,000, and the harvest came in at around 32,000 metric tons, which is about 63% of the cap. So this figure, you've all seen this before, showing both reduction landings and bait landings on the same figure here. Reduction landings going back to 1940, and the reduction landings going back to 1940. The bait landings start around early 1980s. Note the difference in scale on this figure. So on the left-hand side, you have the reduction landings in hundreds of thousands of metric tons. On the right-hand side is the bait landings in tens of thousands of metric tons. And you can see the general trajectory of landings in the recent decade or so. Bait landings have been going up, reduction landings have been going down, but in recent years it's sort of tapered off, especially under the coastwide TAC beginning in 2013. Okay, so this slide is highlighting the incidental fishery in 2018, and it's kind of difficult to compare the 2018 fishery to previous years due to the implementation of Amendment 3 and the reallocation of quota. You can see from the table that landings increased in 2018 relative to the previous year. However, 2018 saw the lowest number of trips occurring, also the fewest number of states participating in the fishery since its inception in 2013. So based on this very rudimentary review of the 2018 incidental catch fishery, it appears that most states were able to keep their fisheries, their directed fisheries, open throughout the season, that there was sufficient quota there. As noted on the slide, 3 states reported incidental catch landings in 2018, those being Maine, New Jersey, and Virginia, with Maine accounting for roughly 90% of that. Moving to the episodic events set-aside program or fishery in 2018, the quota was set at 4.48 million pounds, which accounted for an overage in 2017. Maine was the only participating state, declaring participation in late July and closing the fishery in early August, landing the whole EESA quota in that short amount of time. There was a small overage, about 160,000 pounds, which Maine did pay back in full. And this table is showing you the usage of the EESA since 2013, and you can see that it has been exceeded in the last few years. So taking a look now at quota performance in 2018, that first column is showing your base quota, and then looking at the second column is the transfers that occurred in 2018. So there were 7 state-to-state transfers. There was also, as I mentioned, a transfer from Maine to the EESA, and this all resulted in a net transfer of 5.2 million pounds to Maine. Final 2018 quotas are listed in the third column there. There were no overages in 2018, and so the 2019 base quota in the far end of the table reflect a TAC of 216,000 metric tons, that's the 2019 TAC, and 4.4 million pounds of redistributed relinquished quota from Delaware and Georgia. This is a look at the biological sampling requirements under Amendment 3. So non-de minimis states are required to collect biological samples based on landings and geographic region. Maine through Delaware are required to collect one 10-fish sample for every 300 metric tons of landings, and Maryland through North Carolina are required to collect one 10-fish sample per 200 metric tons of landings. So all the states met the requirement here, except for Massachusetts fell short of their 8 required samples, and it was noted in the compliance report that this is primarily because of a very short season in 2018. The primary purse seine fishery was only in operation for about 3 weeks, and the state has indicated plans to more intensely sample the purse seine fishery in the future to ensure that the sampling requirement is met. Regarding de minimis status, states are eligible for de minimis status if the bait landings are less than 1% of the total coast-wide bait landings for the most recent 2 years. The states of Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida requested de minimis status for 2019, and the PRT determined that they do qualify. A couple notable comments from the PRT this year. The first being that it's evident that from landings reports and data suggests that Atlantic menhaden have become increasingly available in the New England region, particularly the Gulf of Maine. If you saw from some of the slides in my presentation, Maine's landings increased substantially in 2018 relative to the past few years, acquiring over 3 times its quota through transfers, using up the EESA, and also reporting incidental catch landings. So clearly there's something going on with menhaden. You know, we are aware that the availability of other bait fish has changed in recent years, and there's probably all other social and economic factors going on. The other notable comment here is in regards to the incidental catch provision, and this is sort of a tricky one. I'm going to try my best to explain it. But if, you know, the provision allows states to continue to land menhaden after its quota has been met under the 6,000-pound trip limit. However, there are some instances where states further subdivide its quota to different gear types or different sectors. Typically, majority of the quota in these circumstances will go to the purse seine fishery or sector, and the remaining quota will go to a non-purse seine or small scale or other gears category. And in these cases, the incidental catch provision only applies to the non-purse seine fishery, and it's in this circumstance that you can have a state close its small scale or non-purse seine fishery due to reaching the quota, moving into a incidental catch fishery while there's still quota available for the larger fishery, the purse seine fishery. In regards to the FMP, there's really no guidance for when a state subdivides its quota to different gear types or sectors. So for completeness, sharing with the board that the PRT has and will continue to report landings following the closure of these fisheries as incidental catch, unless the board would like to see that reported differently. Although the PRT is not recommending any action at this time, it is recommended that this incidental catch provision be readdressed in a future management document. So wrapping up with some PRT recommendations, the first is to approve de minimis status for Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And again, noting to readdress the incidental catch provision in some future management document. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Are there questions for Max? Lynn Fagley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Max, I'm just curious, was the PRT with the incidental catch and the issue of the subdivided quotas among gear sectors, were they concerned over, what was their concern with that? Was it a concern of accounting or a concern of equity, or can you be a little bit more specific about what exactly the worry was?
I think it was just pointing out that the provision in the plan requires a state to utilize its full quota before moving to incidental catch. And in this particular circumstance, that's not necessarily happening. I don't think there's any real concerns other than the plan is saying one thing and is sort of gray on what to do when a state further subdivides its quota to different sectors.
I think collectively it was about 300,000 pounds between the two states that fell into that incidental catch amount. So it's not a lot of fish being landed, but it could be different interpretations of the FMP. So PRT recommendation is to just clarify it moving forward. So that's one option for the board. Are there additional questions? Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. Did you put a percentage on the 2018 achievement of the total allowable catch? Was there a percentage there?
The directed landings were 12% below the TAC.
This is for everything, so I'm just kind of cross-checking. Were the metric tons 213,840? Was that what you were showing us? And I was just wondering if you had a percentage there. So.
No, I don't have a percentage, but if you go up to slide 5. So that total at the bottom, under the 2018, that's total landings altogether. A portion of that, 3.2 million pounds, that doesn't count towards the TAC. And that's in pounds. I don't have the metric tons listed up there, but I do have what the total TAC was in pounds at the top of the slide. Does that help?
Go ahead, Rob.
Thank you. That does help. And I guess at least from our workings that we did, it's the last 2 years have been well under 85 versus 87% in 2018, 85% in 2017. And then I guess I would comment that the relinquished quota can't all be used, but is there a plan for when it can't be used? And specifically, Virginia has in law a total allowable landings that can't be exceeded, and yet there's, I think you mentioned a little over 4 million the first year and over 3 million the second year. Well, that's my recollection. And so there's also quota that's just relinquished, but there's not a plan for where that can go after that, I think.
I might be a little confused by the question. So the states are allowed to relinquish quota by December of the current year for the following year. That relinquished quota is automatically redistributed to the states. And so it is given back to everybody and is used in that fashion.
Follow up, Rob?
Yeah, so I guess that was designed for the the relinquishment quota to be apportioned according to the 2009 to 11 percentages. And what I'm indicating, I know in Virginia, we can't take on the amount of relinquished quota that we could because of the situation with the law freezing the amount of allowable landings we have. And I was just wondering, will there be a provision in the future to determine what happens after that? If they can't go to a state, because the percentage was pretty high for Virginia, but Virginia couldn't take on that amount. I think maybe part of it brings up the Amendment 3 quota for Virginia, where we took a minus 0.45 reduction, and then the relinquished quota can bring that up to what's in the Code of Virginia, in the law, but no more than that. That's my understanding, and if you want to think about that for next time around, but I think it's, if someone's relinquishing the quota, they clearly had a destination in mind, that they wanted that quota to go somewhere else. But if it can't go anywhere, that might be a little bit of a situation. Thank you.
Maybe something for the board to consider in a future action if more direction is needed there. States also have the option of not relinquishing quota and just doing a direct transfer to another state if they do want it to go to a particular place. There are other questions? Also take any comments, and I'll comment on the Massachusetts situation with the biological monitoring requirements. As Max pointed out, we did fall short in 2018. However, we did implement a plan for 2019 and have sampled the fishery per the requirements this year already and continue to sample opportunistically. So I don't expect there'll be an issue with Massachusetts' sampling next year. But are there any comments about dealing with the incidental catch provision? I'll assume that unless there's other comments made, that it will be the board's intent to consider addressing that issue in a future management action as recommended by the PRT. And if there aren't any other comments, I would look for a motion to accept the FMP review and the de minimis requests. Is that a motion, Emerson?
Yes, so moved.
All right, thank you. A second by Ray Kane. Is there any opposition to the motion? Seeing none, we'll consider that approved. Thank you, Max.
Nick.
Yes, sorry, Bob. Go ahead.
Since the maker of the motion just said so moved, kind of repeating yours, you may want to read that into the record. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you, Bob. The motion is to move to approve the 2019 Atlantic Menhaden FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis status for Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The motion was made by Mr. Hasbrook, seconded by Ray Kane, and carries without opposition. And then we will move on to our last agenda item to discuss and set the TAC for 2020. And Max will start us off with a presentation, a review of the memo that was provided in your briefing materials.
Madam Chair, point of order, that it was just written up on the screen incorrectly, without opposition, it should have said. Thank you.
So noted. Thank you. Max?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, yes, there was a memo included in meeting materials which sort of reviews the tax setting process and a little bit of background information as well as the board's options for 2020. There's a few copies of it in the back of the room. It might be helpful to have that in front of you, sort of see the tables included in there. So just some background, the TAC is set through board action on an annual basis or for multiple years based on the best available science, which typically takes the form of projections analysis, which are in turn based on the latest available stock assessment. In 2017, during the board's deliberations on Amendment 3, it set the TAC for 2018 and 2019 with the expectation that setting of the TAC for subsequent years would be guided by Menhaden-specific ecological reference points, which, as we've been discussing, won't be ready for board review until February of 2020. So the board still needs to address the TAC for 2020. Again, in 2017, the technical committee prepared a suite of projections for the board to use when setting the TAC for the 2018 and 2019 fisheries. Those projections were based on the 2017 stock assessment update, which is still the assessment used for management. The projections ran through 2020, which is the year in question. The part of the calculations there assumed constant landings at 200,000 metric tons for 2017 through 2020, and that was, again, these projections were done in 2017, and so that was based on the 2017 TAC level. So here's a review of the results of those projections. As you can see, there was a suite of TAC options. This was all based on board guidance from 200,000 metric tons, which was status quo at the time, all the way up to 280,000 metric tons, and you can see the associated probability of achieving respective reference points in 2018, 2019, and then again in 2020. Top table is the target, achieving F target. The bottom table is for the F threshold. And so the board set the TAC at 216,000 metric tons in 2018 and 2019, sort of below the second and third options there. And of note is for the 2020 year, under these projections, there would be zero chance of exceeding either of the reference points in 2020 at that TAC level. So here are the board's options regarding 2020. The board can use those existing projections, which I just went over, and set the TAC today. Alternatively, the board can request updated projections. And keeping in mind that those updated projections would still be based on the 2017 stock assessment update, the board could give guidance to the TC on a suite of options to explore and bring that back to the board at annual meeting, at which case the board could take action at that time. A couple things to keep in mind there is that I think staff feels that the projections wouldn't likely change even if they were updated. The level of landings that occurred in 2017 and 2018 were actually below that level that was assumed in those projections, as well as the proportions of landings coming from the bait and reduction sectors didn't change in those years either. But most importantly, the work to update those projections would certainly detract from the ongoing assessment work, which I think we all are aware is at a pretty critical stage of that process. So all important points to keep in mind. The third option is to defer action on the 2020 TAC until the 2019 benchmarks, the single species and the ecosystem-based benchmark assessments are presented, and new projections based on those assessments can be developed. So under this third scenario, the indecision clause in Amendment 3 would kick in and essentially roll the 2019 TAC into 2020 in the interim. And those are the three options, and I'm going to leave this slide up on the screen for the board to consider, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Max. Are there questions? It was an excellent presentation. Bob Ballou.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Max, with regard to that indecision clause, if that were to be enacted by deferring action, would the board have to return to the 2020 TAC at some point in 2020 to change it from interim to final?
It's a great question. It's another point that I sort of left off from my presentation. So let me first, before I answer that directly, under options 1 and 2 here, the board could always revisit that TAC in the future, following review. I think it would take a 2/3 vote to bring it back to the table. Under option 3, again, the intent behind this option would be to defer action until following review of those benchmark assessments, in which case new projections can be developed and reviewed. And so I think inherently there would be resetting of the TAC under that option.
Tony Kearns, do you want to add to that?
to get to Bob's point, if you wanted to keep it the same, you could just leave it and not vote on it again.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Max, thank you for the presentation. I was very excited and intrigued, as I'm sure we all were, to hear the presentations from Drs. Onstead and Drew about the upcoming assessment. We know that there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be different. There's going to be different data. Some things have changed. And we also, I think, all remember the epic, protracted conversations about setting TACs for this fishery. So I'm going to make a motion, and I'm going to suggest we all go home and rest and eat our Wheaties and get ready for the results of the great work that's been done to come to us in February. So with that, I would like to move to maintain the TAC for 2020 at 216,000 metric tons, with the option to revisit the 2020 TAC following review of the 2019 single species and ecological reference point benchmark assessments and peer review reports.
Second to the motion, David Borden. And is there discussion on the motion? Fantastic. This is a final action, which would normally require a roll call vote, unless we can do it the easy way, which looks like it might be possible. And so is there any objection to the motion before us today? Bob?
I'm sorry I'm late with my question. I guess I just want to make sure I understand that that the option to revisit is different than a two-thirds majority vote, or is it the same as a two-thirds majority vote? I see Tony Kern's nodding yes, but maybe for the record you might want to clarify that. Thank you.
To change it, it would require a two-thirds majority vote.
Does that cause concern for anyone? That would be whether to increase it or decrease it would require a two-thirds majority vote. Bob?
I just want to be clear. I'm comfortable with the motion. I just want to make sure I understand, though, that we don't necessarily need this motion. The board could defer action and and not pass any motion. The indecision clause would kick in. The effect would be the same. So this is just a more assertive way of doing it. And I agree that we're not undecided. We want to be decided. So I like the spirit of this. I just want to make sure that I understand the distinction, if there is one, between taking this action now versus not taking any action and reverting to the status quo. I'm not really asking a question. I'm just making a comment to make sure that the rest of the board concurs with what we're doing and why. Thank you.
So based on staff guidance, it would require a two-thirds vote to change the 2020 TAC from 216,000 metric tons. So as long as that is clear and on the record, are there any other questions? Is there a need to caucus? Seeing as this is a final action, is there any comment from the public on this motion? Okay, we'll go back to any request if there is any opposition to the motion. Seeing none, the motion carries unanimously. And I think we've broken a record. If there's no other business to come before the board, we are adjourned. Thank you.